the might of the right words and the right behavior. SSSC, 2. June 2012, 1.02 hours, Billy. Translation, by Bruce Lull of the USA.
There is a creational natural law and a recommendation, that right words and a right behavior will benefit each human being who uses them and guarantee a life led in decency, honor and dignity for everyone and bring them friendships. At the same time, honesty and modesty are also predominantly of importance, value, as well as a non-striving for influence and might in a negative sense, which is characteristic of so many human beings. Many have or want influence and might and are so obstinate in that respect, that they do not want to turn away from them and cannot free themselves therefrom, because everything is too deeply anchored in them. From the ground up, however, the creational natural laws and recommendations teach that the human being shall rule positively over himself, herself with all conceivable necessary might, however shall not exercise this might in a negative wise over the fellow human beings. Through every wrong form of education of the educational authorities as well as through the wrong self-education, the human being learns the hunger for control of the fellow human beings and for might over them, and indeed quite contrary to what the creational natural laws determine and recommendations advise, that absolute equality shall prevail among all forms of life, although all herds of living creatures, as well as all groups, families, organizations and states, etc., need a decisive and authoritative leadership. It is nevertheless pre-given through the creational natural laws and recommendations, that the leaders shall be equal to those being led and shall not be dominating, controlling and exercising might in a negative wise. These same laws and recommendations of creational natural origin teach that the human being shall not fight for the might of domination and control of the fellow human beings, but shall place himself, herself on an equal level with all in equality. But no attention is paid to this by the human beings of earth, for through wrong education, through misunderstanding and unknowledge of the creational natural principles, he or she has become selfish, egoistic and might-hungry. This has the consequence that the greater part of the humankind fights for his, her might, defends it with all conceivable unfair means, challenge others and takes it away from them, and this happens both from the simplest of human beings up to those in high positions of the governments, religions, sects and the economy, etc. And the fact is, that there is an enormously strong struggle for might and for the domination and control of the fellow human beings, who, as rank and file and subordinates, have nothing truly human to expect from those who are greedy for might and domination, control. If the domination, control and exercise of might in relation to the fellow human beings is looked at and considered more closely, then it can be seen, that neither honesty and decency, neither humanity and honor, nor dignity get a chance when it is a matter of attaining might. Especially in this stage of attaining might, it is ruthlessly fought by all negative, evil and unfair means, and if the zeal, culmination point of might possessing is actually achieved, then there are always enough gormless followers who cheer for the victors, and indeed even if they are tormented mercilessly by them. The arena of might struggles takes many forms, and even many human beings come into it in order to gradually win dominance over the fellow human beings. But in fact there is another way, namely as a human being to become really human, to control oneself alone and to exercise might only over oneself, while one's own person is put on an equal footing and equal level to the fellow human beings in honor and dignity, in equality and equal rights. But exceedingly few can do that, because they do not know how that functions and how the right behavior must be worked out. There really are only a few, in whom the ability of the right actions and doings pervades. The majority, however, depends on the negative rules of might, hence the principles of equality and equivalence cannot take effect, nor can the modesty, honor, honesty and dignity, through which, however, one's own inner and outer position can really be strengthened. Once the control and might over one's own person has been won, even if it must be very arduously worked out, then it is recognized that the dominion and might of others need not be broken, because only one's own power, the control and being mightful over one's own person, one's own character and one's own positive equalized behavior are of real value. Whoever has influence and might over himself, herself, also decides entirely by himself, herself as to how he or she respects their fellow human beings in honesty, honor, fairness, love and dignity, treats them or leads them humanely without a negative exercise of might if they are elevated in a leadership position. And whoever leads his, her fellow human beings with an open and honest smile, treats and respects them decently as well as respectfully and honorably in equivalence and equal rights, is truly a human being who does not manipulate others. Manipulation of human beings is only inherent in those who have fallen prey to might, who constantly live by rules of dominance and consider themselves to be very much more than they really are. The true human being, however, is far from dominating anyone, but he or she is concerned about setting himself, herself as equal in every respect with his, her fellow human beings, and consequently he or she behaves in every conceivable necessary respect in such a way that he or she is regarded by them as equal and having equal rights. This means that the true human being's honest and right modes of behavior and words are always formed in such a way that trust and solidarity arise from them. However, using the right words and right modes of behavior also means that, outside of any ambition of a wish to struggle for power, everything is rightly perceived and understood, so that no miscomprehension, wrong understandings, comes about and no wrong decisions are made. Fundamentally, care must also be taken to ensure that those human beings to whom the words are addressed and to whom modes of behavior are presented, receive and understand everything rightly and also recognize the honesty and dignity of the whole. If this happens, then it is unavoidable for the righteous ones except for rowdies, know-it-alls, malicious critics, liars and slanderers, etc. that they respond to the honesty of the words and modes of behavior and react positively accordingly. It should be noted, however, that the might-greedy ones who want to dominate the fellow human beings also use the same methods, but in absolutely unhonest and damage-bringing forms for the fellow human beings, wherethrough they can dominate, subjugate and exploit their followers. A true human being, for whom honesty, honor and dignity as well as all virtues together with freedom, peace and harmony signify great values in the life, makes sure that he or she is always his, her own lord and master over himself, herself, decides for himself, herself in all things to which he or she is entitled and consciously bears the responsibility entirely for all and everything as well as for his, her existence and life. This also means that he or she observes the rule to draw attention to himself, herself, his, her rights, his, her knowledge, his, her abilities, his, her possibilities and his, her attitude, and to stand up for this also in the circle of family, friends and acquaintances and also in the public sphere, if this should be absolutely necessary. In doing so, however, there shall not and must not be any role of vindication taken, nor any total self-isolation or withdrawal of oneself, because in such a wise, as the necessity requires, there must always be answers to questions, for which various forms are possible. However, malicious, lying, criticizing, know-it-all and calumnious, defamatory attacks shall not and need not be responded to, reacted to, unless it is absolutely necessary due to special situations. Such attacks lead back without exception to foolish and simple-minded human beings and usually peter themselves out. However, it is important for every human being that he or she is perceived with her honor, honesty and dignity as well as with her knowledge, her deeds and her modes of behavior to such an extent that he or she does not sink into obscurity. But if he or she does not pay attention to becoming perceived, then he or she becomes a loser, for only by the human being drawing attention to himself, herself and by acquiring attributes of the recognition and the respect, does it lead to the fact that he or she is also accorded the value he or she deserves. For him, her, however, this does not only refer to her own family, her circle of friends and acquaintances, but in general also to all her fellow human beings with whom he or she comes into direct or indirect contact. In fact, it is namely such that everything that is not seen by the fellow human beings in one or more individuals, is simply receiving no consideration, counts for nothing and has no value. If the human being and her behavior, attitude as well as her statements, explanations, deeds, actions and words are perceived at all, then it does not matter whether the whole thing is positive or negative, good or bad. What falls into the observation and perception of the human beings or generates headlines in the media, because it is only important that the observations and perceptions are made at all and that headlines attract attention. The fact that friends and enemies then emerge from this is just as unavoidable as the fact that if friends want to be made, then enemies inevitably also appear. But fundamentally it is given that the human being must do something, and indeed on the one hand, to stand before himself, herself, and on the other hand, in order to fall into the attention of the fellow human beings and to be perceived in general. Thus the human being must not hide her own light under a bushel, because otherwise he or she is not perceived and is consistently disadvantaged over and over again, as well as considered stupid and simple-minded. But he or she must also not let her own light to radiantly outshine, otherwise he himself, she herself will only be seen, idolized and uplifted above himself, herself in a circle of light, which, however, inevitably leads to arrogance, megalomania, to the selfishness, imperiousness, overestimation of the self and boastfulness, etc. Therefore, one's own light must always shine, but merely and simply in the right light. And so that this is so and remains or will be the case, the right words and the right modes of behavior must always be chosen and cultivated, because the right words and behavior make the music that the human beings like to hear and perceive. Truthfully, even a single word or just a single short sentence as well as the behavior determines how the human being is assessed. The words and the behavior of each individual human being are evaluated by her fellow human beings, consequently a judgment, an assessment is made by them, as a result of which the human being is either humiliated, hated, despised, disregarded or respected, esteemed, loved, honored, and appreciated. In dealing with the human being, nothing is as effective and important for the individual as her language, her words and her behavior, because attention is paid to that like nothing else, and thereupon it is assessed and judged. The language, words, and the behavior of the individual human being direct thoughts and feelings in very specific directions, so that many friends can be won or many enemies can be made, depending on how everything affects the different human beings. The language and just a few words as well as the behavior can turn friends into enemies and enemies into friends. The right language and the use of the right words as well as the right modes of behavior of the human being lead in any case, however, to the fact that friends gather around him, her, and that he or she is esteemed, respected, honored, appreciated and loved by them. It is not to be avoided, however, that also hostile-minded ones appear, know-it-alls, cheaters, deceivers, critics and all sorts of other adversaries, antagonists, who, out of envy and other base motives, fail to acknowledge and accept what others have to show towards them in terms of great values. It is important, however, for the honest and good human being to not bother about these adversaries and not to pay attention to their rotten doing, but simply to let them run round in their irrational doing, because any vindication against them would only strengthen them in their feeble-minded doing, which finds the reason in their boundless stupidity. It is all the more important for the righteous human being to know how he or she must use his, her language and her words, and how he or she must display his, her behavior, how and when he or she creates great benefit for himself, herself, or how and when he or she harms himself, herself. Using certain words is of enormous importance, because the right choice of words creates many friendships and attracts many like-minded ones, and when speaking it is of the greatest importance that one does not constantly talk about one's own person and of the I. If one is already speaking of one's own person, then this must be in a simple and non-egocentric language, and indeed in the wise that everything is presented in a simple manner of speaking and with plain, modest words, without making oneself stand out and presenting oneself as a hero. To modestly tell something interesting, not boasting, but plainly in a simple wise with equally simple words, always creates attentive listeners and friends, while a human being who, to the contrary, only highlights himself, herself, boasts and exaggerates, reaps only boredom, inattentiveness and enmity. If the human being wants to win friends, to be respected, honored and appreciated, then he or she must be formed in honesty and certainty in his, her attitude and in his, her thoughts and feelings in such a way that he or she is a part of the whole of humanity, even when he or she leads his, her very own life as an individuum of their own. In this wise he or she may well speak of himself, herself if something is related to him, her alone. But if any fellow human beings are involved in this activity or in this life or in the therewith connected deeds and actions etc., then it is in any case disrespectful, unhonest, dignityless, mean and selfish as well as contemptuous when any things are spoken of in the first person when other human beings are involved. If only the I is spoken of, when others are also involved in something, as for example in relation to property, possessions, goods and chattels, belongings, work, a deed or an act, etc., then this is not only unfair and selfish, egomaniacal, but it also corresponds to a lie, a deception and a calumny. So, if there is a commonality in any wise, then the I never applies, but only the we, for what is done together is not the matter of an individual, but of all those who are involved in it together. This also applies when something is striven for together, when it is a matter of doing and undertaking something together, to determine and carry out something. And if the we is then spoken of in this wise, then all who are involved in the whole feel addressed by it, to which it may even be said that through the use of the honest and dignified we, enemies also feel addressed, through which some enmity can be broken. This is based on the fact that when a human being is addressed with the we, he or she feels consciously part of the human community. This creates a brain chemical reaction through which the hormone dopamine is produced, which permeates the thoughts and feelings with impulses of happiness. Namely, if the language, the words and also the behavior of a human being is directed to the corresponding community of human beings addressed through the honest and dignified form of the use of the value of the word we, then positive thought and feeling impulses arise for him, her. And this is also the case when the human being, through what he or she speaks, perhaps reduces his, her reputation somewhat. The use of the little word we is in general and also in the special case of tremendous importance in relation to working with human beings, but also please, which likewise has quite a special meaning, as well as shall or should instead of must. If something shall or should be done, and regarding this the phrase this or that should still be done is used, then this corresponds to both a request, as well as to the fact of something that cannot be postponed, which has just arisen and shall be done, but not must be done in a command-based wise, but rather shall be done voluntarily. If must is used in the language in the sense mentioned, then in any case the whole thing always equals a command and coercion, which, however, is omitted by the shall, which gives expression to the voluntariness of doing something. And if, with respect to something, the whole is connected with please, even if something is asked for or with should it serves as an indirect invitation to the handling of matter, then the free will of the other human being is addressed by this. Consequently he or she has to decide himself, herself whether he or she wants to do something or to refrain from doing it. And, if something is left up to him, her in this wise, then he or she becomes in this wise more amenable, and from his, her own initiative, complies with the indirect request to do what shall or should be done. With this self-determined voluntary insertion of himself, herself into a task or into some matter, there is also connected a harmony, peaceableness, an appropriate decorum/seemliness/ethics and morality as well as commitment, a consonance and a unifying, connecting, friendly and joyful behavior, etc. If, on the contrary, a must is given, then this is always compulsorily conditioned, and then reluctance, joylessness, resistance and all other negative impulses appear automatically, in which case the things to be done may suffer from it in a qualitative wise and are carried out with poor performance, because just owing to the compulsion of must, the whole thing is only arduously dealt with. This, once observed and considered and assessed from a purely psychological view, if something has to be spoken about or something told or explained, then there is a golden rule for this which should be strictly observed, whereas also in this case by the use of shall or should, it is left up to the person speaking, telling or explaining whether he or she wants to adhere to the rule or not, and this rule says and teaches that always only as much as necessary shall be said, and indeed regardless of whether it is about sensitive or hard-hitting things and topics. If, for example, the material being discussed is didactic rich, then brief explanations encourage the listeners to think about everything for themselves and to try to logically follow the whole thing, which in turn leads to the fact that sooner or later correspondingly pertinent questions are asked that require further explanations. This can of course take time, from a few minutes to several years, during which everything is thought over, logically followed and comprehended. This is the unavoidable developmental process of oral learning, as it begins with children at an early age, when the educators explain all sorts of things to them and they have to answer questions. Depending on the case, however, it is otherwise also the case that the person speaking and explaining removes the basis for unnecessary speculation when certain sensitive things and topics are brought up or explained only as far as necessary, by the rational only speaking just as much as necessary and avoiding superfluous discussions. The person speaking and explaining or teaching also does not have to bear the responsibility. Therefore, if misunderstandings arise among the listeners due to misinterpretations, so the rule shall always apply, that when speaking, explaining, narrating and teaching, everything shall always be presented concisely, dryly and plainly, unembellished, nevertheless honestly, clearly, distinctly and to the point. On the one hand, many values are thus quickly and comprehensively brought up and expressed, and on the other hand, this form of speaking promotes the interest of the listeners, whereby the person speaking becomes, so to speak, the only rooster in the yard, which, however, must not then lead to the boastfulness, to the selfishness, imperiousness and to the megalomania on his or her part. Then again, a rule applies, which namely says that one should remain calmly and simply on the ground of modesty and restraint. Dignified human beings say little, only in accordance with the reality and its truth, and they speak only when it is necessary, with which they also have a very impressive, trusting and interpersonally valuable effect on the fellow human beings. However, they are also very clearly aware that if they speak only a little and only in accordance with the reality and its truth, they cannot say anything banal, foolish and nothing wrong, false. If something is said, spoken, explained, told or taught, then this always requires a certain point in time, consequently a precise harmonization of time, i.e., an exact, precise coordination of the processes. Timing is to be observed, so for example, the precise and right moment, when and how something shall be said, done or explained. If this is not taken into account and paid attention to, then this is a serious mistake which can bring much detriment, much difficulty and lots of terrible things, in which case this word alone shall be remembered, that whoever is in the wrong place at the wrong time or whoever says the wrong thing at the wrong time, suffers great harm. If likewise when speaking, explaining, telling, instructing and teaching, the coordination of the processes and the right moment are not paid attention to, then a going wrong of the whole thing is preconditioned and predetermined. This, however, must be avoided and requires that everything is properly taken heed of and considered, but if this is disregarded, then it is a serious error that can bring enormous damage. Even the words and sentences that are used must be constantly controlled, because otherwise there is the danger of getting stuck in the nettles or of making oneself impossible. Even the best concocted words and sentences must be checked again and again for its rightness and, if necessary, revised. This is also necessary when the time is ticking, something is delayed or goes faster than was anticipated. If a wrong word or a wrong sentence is said at the wrong time, something is explained, told, instructed or taught at the wrong time, then this can lead to a personal or to a communal catastrophe. This is also true in relation to when the human being wants to make his, her voice heard or to demand his, her rights in any matter. It is thereby also important that it is quickly and rationally thought, considered and quickly acted, because delays due to any slow thinking and considering can bring tremendous harm. This is precisely a point that might obsessed ones hate like poison, because they usually want to have everything done quickly to their benefit. Hence they bring time into play as a decisive factor, which is usually lacking in the fellow human beings, because they go forth in calmer and more leisurely ways with regard to their world of thoughts and feelings. So they have a lot of time to decide, but this time is missing for the power-obsessed ones, Consequently for them the time plays a decisive role and they are constantly pressed to achieve their fulfillment of might. But this is inevitably connected with the fact that they influence the views and opinions of the listeners or subordinates with tumult and coercion-based rhetorical manipulations and break their own and only weakly existing will. Thus, the listeners or subordinates are not able to prevent the plans of those who crave might or to quash such plans when they are in the making. So it is important for the normal simple human being, to whom the might greed itself is not characteristic, typical, that he or she always keeps to the reality and its truth, which also means that he or she makes use of his, her own ratio, use of his, her intellect and rationality, and through this recognizes the might greed of the mightful ones and takes a stand against it, instead of joining in with the howling of might. This may deeply hurt some human beings who have fallen into submissive bondage and are dependent on some human beings greedy for might, regard them as idols, lie at their feet and grovel in the dust before them, but humiliate themselves to the point of roaring humility. In dealing with the human being, it is of particular importance that he or she is addressed by his, her correct name, because to hear one's own name from the mouth of a fellow human being or to read it in a letter, etc., is music to his, her ears and creates impulses of happiness in him, her. This truly has nothing to do with presumptuousness, megalomania, selfishness and the like, but with the fact that he or she as a human being wants to be appreciated in decency, honesty and respect, which indeed is also his, her right. Doctor and director or other titles are of no importance for a healthy, normal and sensibly thinking human being, because fundamentally such titles are like smoke and mirrors and say nothing in relation to the character, the personality and the state of the humanness, and as a rule only the egotistical, the self-important and the arrogant etc. are eager for such titles with regard to being mentioned when addressing them. In everything, the sound and the right emphasis of the words and sentences play a very important role, as well as their positive or negative form. In this regard, especially in the 1980s, an evil wrong form of emphasis of words and sentences emerged around the world, through which a word and sentence as well as language disharmony resulted, which continues up into the present time of the 21st century. And just as this extremely negative and bad form of the word and sentence emphasis has taken hold, also everything negative and bad has taken hold worldwide. Namely, since this language disharmony, precisely the wrong emphasis of words and sentences, has arisen, very much of what the human being of Earth undertakes in the world goes haywire, very much goes wrong and moves in destructive ways. The completely disharmonious forms of the organized noise, which calls itself music and singing since the 1980s, as well as the wrong emphasis of words and sentences, has had an increasingly bad effect on everything to this day. Thus, since then, religious sectarian terrorism has spread worldwide, massacres of human beings through uprisings and more acts of war have increased to an immense degree, as well as a worldwide mismanagement of the banks, the states, companies, corporations and families, etc., has become rampant and gained the upper hand. And all of these are undeniable effects of what has been formed by a very bad negative trend of the wrong emphasis of words and sentences from the 1980s, even if the self-appointed 7 times as clever ones find it ridiculous and do not want to admit it. The whole thing, however, causes enormous physical and psychological pain to many human beings, which can no longer be comprehensively processed by the pain center in the brain. Consequently they flip out more and more, fall prey to psychological crises, give free rein to immense aggressions and become antisocial as well as incapable of living, and so on. If the language, the words and the throughout resulting sentences of the human being are looked at and considered more closely, then it leads to the recognition that they contain very much more in themselves as value than only their pure content. The language, the words and the sentences, with which the human being communicates and comes to an understanding among themselves and with each other, are an emotional might that nobody can escape. Thus, individual words alone determine whether someone is taken seriously or not, and if, for example, an and, or, but, nevertheless, then thus, so what, all right, I or nonetheless etc. is used constantly or frequently when speaking, then the human being who is speaking is thus offering a large area of attack, which reveals his, her purpose, zeal and calls forth a distrust as well as antipathy. If one's own strength and one's own integrity of the inner nature as well as the modesty, honesty, honor and dignity come to the fore in a conversation, in a talk or during instructions and explanations, then these must also be openly expressed through the language. However, this requires that in relation to one's own values, one's own knowledge as well as one's own abilities and possibilities, a healthy dominance resting in modesty must be shown and come into the picture, through which no manipulation of the listeners comes about, but on the contrary a willing interest of one's own, through which they also recognize, acknowledge and respect the values of the speaker. It is not about a might struggle between the person speaking and the listeners, nor about wanting to gain influence, but solely and exclusively about the fact that, for the listeners, everything is appreciated in no uncertain terms with interest, whereas through the whole can be understood and logically followed, which also includes a questioning of the matter, as well as the necessary answers and explanations. Only human beings who are immodest and strive for might, underpin everything that they say and do with such a perceptible dominance, that with it the listeners are manipulated and believe that it is their own opinion when they take the same line as the ones striving for might. Those who are obsessed with might fight for their dominance in every situation in an absolutely immodest and negative kind and wise, in which manipulation, duality and coercion, as well as frequently acting, lying and deception and also slander, revenge and retaliation are indispensable means for them. And when they strive to increase their influence and their might, then they themselves do not even consciously perceive what they actually do in terms of evil and tongue as well as inhumane things. When they strive for their dominance and command or defend their position of might with manipulation, duality and coercion and all dishonest, unfair means. In all this, however, the rule is that very often they do not fight openly, but only subtly, in order to fool the fellow human beings through lies and deception and not to let them see the true face and the true intentions that are hidden behind the might-greedy machinations. However, if these rotten emotions and machinations of the might-obsessed ones are recognized by the fellow human beings, then situations arise which undermine and make it impossible for those striving for might to achieve their determinations/ends/zeal. So the might behavior and the preservation of the might-obsessed ones can function only so long as the fellow human beings do not control their own intellect, their own rationality and their own power of decision, but rather everything is left to the might-obsessed ones. As long as the might-obsessed ones can control their emotions by the use of their rational thinking and hide them from the fellow human beings so that they do not recognize the true nature of the ones obsessed with might, so long can they exercise their might and keep the people under their thumb. And that has rubbed off also on the whole earthly humankind since time immemorial, which has proven to be true in the course of thousands of years of the earthly history of humanity. The history of the earthly humankind is a history of wars, of massacres, uprisings, revolutions and of murders, criminality, crimes as well as of the Ozctet religious sectarian delusion which has cost millions of human lives. And it is the history of revenge and retaliation, of greed and avariciousness as well as unfairness, torture, death penalty, depravity and all evil loss art dungeon. In the course of this, tremendously evil and bad thoughts, feelings and emotions have always played a part, which, however, every human being should fundamentally control to his, her best and not offer them as a weapon to the might-greedy ones and enemies. If the human being wants to appear valuable in the best wise in life in relation to the fellow human beings, then he or she has to make himself, herself indispensable in a good and positive sense, which however can only be achieved through words and a behavior of the honesty, honorableness and the dignity. In this sense he or she has to face the fellow human beings with the correspondingly right words and with his, her modes of behavior, as well as with his, her deeds, actions, thoughts and feelings, the feelings for others and in the living out of all the virtues. He or she must never veer away from these values, but if he or she does so anyway, then he or she suffers endless defeats, inner misery, hardship, suffering and pain. Truthfully, it is the duty of the human being to assert himself, herself in all conceivable situations in life, and if he or she is unable to do so, then his, her obligation is to seek the help of wise fellow human beings accordingly. Fundamentally, however, the human being has to make his, her own decisions through his, her own decisiveness and to put them into practice, to develop his, her own creativity in all forms of his, her own abilities and possibilities and also to bear the full responsibility for it. It is the duty of every human being to cultivate and display an elementary expression of his, her independence, his, her love, of the inner peace and of the inner freedom and harmony as well as of the feelings for others, of the humaneness, honor, kind-heartedness, honesty and dignity in every situation of life, and only if this is done and all decisions in this respect are made by the individual human being himself, herself, does he or she determine his, her own course in his, her life. By doing so, however, he or she also provides relief for his, her fellow human beings in many respects, because he or she exemplifies responsibility to them and shows it to them, but also relieves them of responsibility in many kinds of things. Many human beings are afraid of being someone themselves who is supposed to bear responsibility in any kind and wise towards the fellow human beings, the fauna and flora and the planet etc. And this is even so with some who have to rule as superiors or otherwise lead human beings in leading positions and assign or control work. This fear is usually based on the fact that, on the one hand, decisions are to be made by oneself and secondly, that errors could be made. Fact is, however, that when deciding on any things, it does not necessarily matter that everything is done right, because fundamentally errors are always allowed, permissible, because without them nothing can prosper and nothing can become right, and besides errors are there in order to learn from them, to resolve them and then to make everything better, so that in the end with right words and a right behavior, more good, correct and error-free decisions are made than wrong decisions. It is the same with every work, deed or action etc. which is to be carried out, although it is then more important whether the correspondingly necessary information is correctly received and understood as well as correctly ambitious, or whether it is misunderstood and carried out without interest and thus errors arise. The might of the right words and the right behavior in every respect also refers to the instructing and teaching in relation to the teaching of the truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of the creational energy, teaching of the life, which is to be of help and shall be signposts for the human being of earth to make thoughts and feelings about the creational natural laws and recommendations, to perceive them, to understand them and to follow them. In this regard, the words of the person who gives the teaching must be chosen in a right and appropriate wise, and their behavior must also correspond to the teaching. And this teaching, the spiritual teaching or the teaching of the truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of the creational energy, teaching of the life, does not contain anything in itself in such a wise that the world is to be changed by it, as the simple-minded may misunderstandingly assume and thus attack, for example, the spiritual teaching and those who teach it. These attacks take place, however, only because the discernment of the attackers is not yet properly developed and is not formed to the understanding of the reality and its truth by the use of intellect and rationality, because they lack the decisive life experience by which a clear-sightedness could come about perceptively. And if such simple-minded human beings want to make wise speeches and thus believe that they would choose the right words for it, as this has been common and used by those who believe themselves to be clever since time immemorial, such as if one wants to change the world, one must start with oneself, then this style of speaking has a bitter taste. Here, what is bitter is related to the ununderstanding of the person who uses such dubious old-fashioned words without understanding what is actually being wrongly said. Neither the spiritual teaching nor any other good and positive teaching concerning the fact that the human being shall turn to the creational-natural laws and recommendations, perceive them, accept them and put them into practice in life, is directed towards wanting to change the world. Every such teaching serves only for this purpose, that the human being is to work on himself, herself, and shall form himself, herself into the true human being, whereby the shall always stands for the fact that the human being has to decide for himself, herself, whether he or she wants to do something or not. Thus, every corresponding teaching is directed solely and exclusively to the individual human being, who voluntarily strives towards that which is instructive. And if he or she does that, then he or she also exemplifies the whole of the teaching to the fellow human beings, namely because only by doing so can enough consideration be given to that which is taught orally, in writing, as well as through deeds, actions and the behavior, in terms of the right words, of the good, of the positive and of that which is right. With the spiritual teaching, that is, the teaching of the truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of the creational energy, teaching of the life, as well as with every other good and positive teaching, the right words are of significance, which shall be directed to appeal to the human being of earth, so that he or she shall make an effort to perceive the creational natural laws and recommendations, to align himself, herself with them, to accept them and to develop mentally change and behave in accordance with them. And the shall is expressly in the foreground, because in every kind and wise, the whole of the for or against lies in one's absolutely own decision of every single human being. So nothing is thereby connected with manipulation, proselytizing, missionizing, dualt and coercion, because everything lies in the free decision of each individual. And contrary to the religions and sects and various organizations etc., the spiritual teaching and every other good and positive teaching given in the same framework is neither a fascinating instrument of salvation and might, nor something supposedly advantageous in terms of material things or with regard to godly help and a best or at least a good godly destiny determinant. Every God-delusion belief in every conceivable form is bound to obligations and compensatory measures, compensations in such a wise that some divinity/godliness, some godly help and divine/godly blessing etc. has to be prayed for, more specifically begged for. And if then the begging is supposedly heard, then this corresponds again to a reward, namely on the part of the godliness, which in turn however requires a reciprocity, compensatory measure on the part of the believers and those praying, or rather begging. Consequently they must answer the granted divine/godly gift, that is, the divine/godly help with clearly exaggerated prayers of thanks. In the end, it must be said that those who do not choose the right words and do not form her behavior rightly will be disadvantaged by life and by their fellow human beings. When choosing the right words and the right behavior, however, it is also important not to disregard the fellow human beings, nor to elevate oneself above them and not to treat them as less than oneself. One's own true greatness must always be somewhat dampened outwardly by modesty, but if this is not done, then imperiousness, selfishness and overestimation of oneself, etc., arise. Therefore it is important to cultivate true modesty also in the use of the right words and in relation to the right behavior, which corresponds to a great skill in dealing with the fellow human being. Modesty is also a dampening measure, not to talk bigly of oneself and not to let oneself shine in one's own light, because the more the human being through immodesty makes himself, herself and her deeds, actions, words and behavior shine, the more he or she irritates those who listen to him, her. And this happens because one's own shining, by which one's own person is to be lifted up as a rule by boasting, etc., causes the fellow human beings to fall all the more deeply into darkness and makes them appear as inferior and insignificant. Thus it happens that the more luminous the human being pretends to be, the darker her fellow human beings see themselves and even consider himself, herself to be foolish and inferior, which often leads to psychical consciousness-based disorders. Therefore, if the human being deals discerningly and wisely in the relationships with her fellow human beings in true and honest modesty and knows the laws and recommendations of the equality, equal value, equivalence and equal rights, he or she knows that her own superiority over other human beings is in any case trivial, foolish, wrong and damage-bringing. So it is absolutely not necessary and therefore not needed for a true and honestly modest human being to show a superiority over others, such as by boasting, lying, spreading rumors and calumnies. The only right thing is to express oneself only with true, good, positive and right words as well as in the same wise with an equally directed behavior and with one's own opinions, one's own knowledge and feelings for others, with true love and wisdom and with valueful deeds and actions.
Arrogance.
For the human being, arrogance means that he or she exposes himself, herself in narrowness regarding her intellect as well as her rationality, as well as of the intelligence.
SSSC, December 16, 2015. 10:57 p.m., Billy.